All right, I will start the recording again. Good morning. How are you doing? Or afternoon, I
Uh,
guess.
yeah, it's afternoon here. Doing great. Sun is shining. Summer has arrived, and hope I'll gonna have the chance to enjoy it soon.
Great. So did you see the article I sent you last night?
I just opened my email, and then
Okay,
I realized it's there.
okay, that's fine. So yes, as you probably recall, last episode we walked through your 8 tools for transformation, and I promised to try and come up with a scientific theory or at least conceptual model for understanding and illuminating those tools. So possibly because I'm drinking beer again now that Lent is over, I decided to call this the IPA model.
Nice.
And yeah, all right. So let me just dive into it. So you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So um, the thing that I thought was most interesting for me was calling out the role of the instigator as a fundamental part of the analysis. And so and then the second decision was trying to make this as general as possible. And so I work with this general idea of a population and try to abstract it away from human beings in social groups to more abstract computational agents or even social animals. And in particular, we were talking about different scales last time. I personally experience my life or myself as sort of Minsky's society of the mind, right? I have a very crowded head full of different personalities who argue and fight and occasionally reconcile. And in particular, personal transformation for me is really about how do I establish my uh, spirit or true self or whatever as a legitimate authority over the unruly conflict of behaviors. As a personal anecdote, I dealt with a number of addictive behaviors and went through some fairly intense um, therapy in I guess it was actually my 30s. And a lot of it was actually journaling to myself and identifying the different parts of myself that were acting out, and very similar to Schwartz's internal family systems. So that's kind of where I come, and also, I come at this. So that's kind of just the preamble there. So the idea is that you have an instigator who's trying to spread a behavior across a particular population of agents. And so, this is kind of a, I guess, pseudocode, but try to borrow your terminology as much as possible. So the agents interact through games. So I decided to go with game theory as the primary framing for how I think through this. And the games are played for both resources and status. And you can often blur those together, but I have often found that focusing on either resources or status distorts the analysis quite a bit. So I found it easier to just go ahead and split those up. Resources are tangible and tend to have an absolute value, whereas status is intangible and tends to have relative value. And I got this part actually from a writer who was trying to come up with a rational theory of society. And he started with just working with resources. And he said, well, clearly you only need to find an amount of resources and we should be able to make this all work. But he said, well, in the latest revision, I feel like I need to include status because that also matters. And I don't think he realized that that blew up his entire analysis. Because while you only need so much food or so much land, there really is no upper bound on the amount of status you can aspire towards. And that tends to introduce either a 0 or infinity into your calculations if you're not careful.
Right. And in terms of status, having this potential of infinity. And then the next question that appears in my mind is, what's the source of status? And what is the mechanism, the system supporting it? And then maybe that would give a little bit insight in what would be the extent of status. and again, we from our society so far have learned that status is about other people evaluating it to a certain degree, people, their efforts or their results or created labels. Then possibly there is some kind of sense that we can attach to how far the status can go. And on the other hand, knowing that our human brains are very creative and infinite to some degree in their creativity, it might be infinite because we don't know.
Right. So in this model, we define status as existing relative to a game, right, or within a population. And what's interesting, if you think about historically, the great innovators in society have created new status games, whether it was Alexander and Empire, Gandhi and nonviolence, Bacon and the scientific revolution, and those names themselves imply that they have won a sort of immortal status game.
Right.
Yes. And so, well, I wouldn't know if it's necessarily infinite. I would say it's unbounded. Yes. In the sense that any status game you can define a metagame around it, which allows you to create more status than that, or at least aspire towards, whether you can successfully achieve it.
Right.
And that's why in the sense in which there is that sense in which, and in particular, what's interesting about status to me is that it's always relative, or at least functionally it's relative, right? So I can say, I want to be more famous than Alexander the Great. I don't particularly, but I could imagine that.
Right, yes, now I got it.
Okay, so resources and status, and that agents are diverse. I think that's an important factor. And getting back to our definition of being human, I define diversity of values, which determines which games they play, and capabilities, which affects which games they win. So that's kind of an interesting way to frame agents here, and to define values, actually. And then, perhaps like you, I have grown very tired of the rational agent model as assumed in economics. But I do think it's important to say that agents act with intention, meaning that they tend to play games that they expect to win or gain something out of, even if they're just gaining status at the loss of resources.
At least being good at it, yes.
Right. Or
in
at least
terms of the choices.
they think that they are, right, is that they don't play games intending to lose, but they may play games with imperfect information about the risks and benefits. And importantly, which is I think where the rational actor model tends to fall down the worst, is that we act based on our values, which we have imperfect information about, and they vary over time and environment. Right? We are not these atomic individuals who have this fixed set of values independent, but in fact, they vary over time and they're hugely dependent on our environment, especially our social environment. There's a theory that I haven't figured out how to work in here, I call the fractal identity graph, is that we have an identity that is multi-layered. And so, and depending on the context and the external pressures, different aspects of that identity get surfaced more strongly, right? The common one that, when you're traveling on a bus in a foreign country and you meet someone from your same state, you feel this deep affinity for them, even though you could care less if you met them in the same state, right? Right? Like you and I have bonded a great deal over our shared MIT heritage. Right. Even though I don't really think about it that much in general, but it provided a useful point of commonality,
right,
in that identity. I sparked a thought, or should we keep going?
Oh, Yeah, just keep going.
All right. So using these definitions, I figured this can give us a good starting point for defining flourishing. And defining flourishing as the aggregate resources and capabilities of all agents within a population. And I'm not sure if that's the best possible interpretation, but it's a good simple starting point. And what's interesting to me about that is that flourishing in this sense is kind of around the harder aspects of resources and capabilities rather than the softer aspects of status and values. And I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness, possibly both, but it does make it a bit more of an objective thing. And that you can assess whether people are playing games if they're winning, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And then we can define pro-social, zero-sum, and anti-social relative to that sense of flourishing. So far, so good?
Yeah, I'm trying to get into the game. It's not always easy, and yes, but again, it's interesting. Games are part of our lives, and this is part of our human evolution in so many ways.
Right, yeah, and I'm not saying that the only thing that we do is games. I'm saying that in terms of building a simple model that tries to capture the important dynamics we care about and identify points of leverage, using games as a framing mechanism seems to be the, for this iteration, it's the one that seems to offer the most promise of providing useful insights. So, and that's and in fact, the way I got to this was this idea of status games. Someone once described social media as the ultimate status game. And I've been thinking a lot about that during the Great Reset we're going through, where a lot of the traditional status games we play are non-functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you actually realize that, and one thing I've been preaching a lot to my friends is that, there was a song going around, there was this Everything is Awesome song from the Lego movie, which I could do a whole series on the Lego movie. I consider it the most profound analysis of society and the human condition since Augustine's City of God, and much easier to dance to. But there was a version going around called Everything is Canceled. Everything is canceled. Everything is stopped due to COVID-19.
Oh, nice.
Everything is canceled. Wash your hands and stay clean. And I was thinking about that, like, in some sense, everything is canceled. And you realize that, and for many people, like, seriously canceled, like their job, their sense of identity, their social network, sense of identity, all these things are canceled. And it really makes you think, like those of us who still have a sense of calling and purpose and family are really blessed in this time. But I've been thinking a lot about when reality comes rushing back in like a flood, which status games do I want to play? And saying I can actually choose whether I want to play that game or not. Do I want to play the church game? Do I want to play the job game? Do I want my kids to play the school game? And having the mental framing of it as a game rather than an obligation or a duty or an economic machine is a really interesting way to create some mental space around it.
Yes. Now I kind of got deeper into your description of the proposal, and certainly by this revelation that there's great reset, as you say, or the great reminder, as I used to refer. Pretty much we're speaking about this happening, and then the different angles or viewpoints. But in the end, it's the same thing, and we are just more inclined to notice what's more resonating with us. And I really love how you positioned this entry points and descriptives of the game and to their practical application at this moment when people have the chance to revise their list of games. And as you just said, am I happy with playing all of the previous games? So now you have this kind of a moment of time to revisit and re-question everything. And as you sang before about everything is canceled, I mean, maybe the biggest things that are canceled are constant disturbance is canceled, constant rat race is canceled, or at least, what's that, hibernated, or the other, like a
Suspended.
computer, suspended. Yes, thank you. Oh, yes. I like it.
All right, thank you. And this is where it gets interesting. So, and this is the to me, this is where the insights get. And the thing about a game is that you can define the rules in a way that there's clear payoffs, right? And you can think of things in terms of who benefits from the game and the costs of a game. So, I don't know if there's a better term for this. I've been using the phrase transformational intervention to describe kind of what I think your tools are trying to help people do. And so, and I think the interesting thing that makes interventions hard is that there's the base game, which is the like, hey, everyone let's play the game of washing hands. And the way I would describe your canonical intervention is let's increase the status of those who are already washing their hands. So that the people who are green, and so the people who are adjacent to them in yellow say, oh, I want to have that status too. I will also wash my hands, right? And so that's the base game. But then there's also the meta game being played, which is that the people who are putting their credibility behind this, and especially, you know, like the great example, you know, positive example is the Seattle flu study, is they basically bet their reputation that something serious was going on and, you know, defied authority to get data out there. And, you know, my friends who forwarded me articles and analyses saying, you know, hey, this is serious, you got to take this seriously. There are many ways to describe what they are doing, but one way of analyzing what they are doing is as a game. Is they're essentially playing what I would like to call credibility poker, which is there's a situation and you can decide whether you're going to play this game, and then you throw credibility into the pot. And the more credibility you throw into the pot, the greater chance of affecting the outcome. And if that outcome happens the way you predict it will, you multiply your credibility. And if you put it in there and it fails, you lose all that credibility. Very similar to Taleb's idea of skin in the game. And what's interesting is that, you know, the washing the hands thing, I was thinking like, it's fairly benign, right? It was actually a commercial game back in the day with soap manufacturers, right? And I don't know if anyone's done an analysis about whether the rise of the soap industry was correlated with the Spanish flu. But I do know that like soap operas exist because the biggest advertisers in the era of radio were soap companies, right? Laundry and soap were some of the first commercial goods.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You've heard the phrase soap opera, right?
Oh, yes.
But now you know why.
Now I know why. I learned something new today.
Right. So anyway, so in that case, you would say, well, are you just wanting me to be clean because it's actually healthier, or are you just trying to sell me soap? Yeah, and you know, the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness, I don't know for sure, but I suspect it might have been an advertising slogan. And so, but nowadays it's been socialized enough that we don't really worry about that. But in general, it's a question you have to ask, right? And that's kind of the three-part analysis here, is that let's assume that the base, you know, so generally speaking, if we're in a population and someone says everyone should play this game, the implication, if not the assertion, is that this is a pro-social game, that we'll all be better off if everyone plays this game. But the fact of the matter is that if you all play a game that I'm promoting, I'm also way better off. I'm increasing my status and often my resources by getting you to play a game. And that creates this conflict of interest between the base game and the metagame. And so antisocial agents who are going to lose relative status have an incentive to sabotage the game. And antisocial instigators, the dark pattern, have an incentive to cloak at least either the local or global antisocial impact under the appearance of a pro-social game. And because of this, because of that reality, agents who really are pro-social are forced to navigate between those two possible failure modes. And that's where I think your point of your tools basically are driven around social proof, I would say, and social reinforcement, right? Is that if I see, and I think that's why I think, social proof is an incredibly powerful strategy. There's other benefits of sociality, social identity, social thing, but from an evolutionary perspective, you can see why social proof is so hardwired into us. Because it's a great way to avoid many failure modes, not all by any means. And what's interesting, I don't know if you studied your history, but as the technique of communication changes, we lose our social immunity, right? And so when email erupted, we had all these email scams. When radio came, we had the era of the great dictators, right? When the printing press came, we had the 100-Year War, right? And these we achieve a certain social equilibrium in terms of harmful and negative versus positive tools. Now, and those themselves are imperfect strategies, right? They suppress certain useful innovations, but that's considered an acceptable price for dampening the really harmful negative ones. The other game that came to mind, which I think is really useful to think about, is renunciation, right? So given that people are suspicious of instigators because they benefit, one way that they can signal that they can be taken, that they're really concerned about the overall social good, is this idea of renunciation, right? And I've been studying medieval history a lot lately. And even before this, I was thinking a lot about Saint Benedict and the medieval monasteries that birthed Western civilization as Rome crumbled. And one of the things that I've always found bizarre from a theological perspective is why Catholic priests didn't marry. And I can't even find any good sources of how that tradition started. But one of the interesting consequences of that, though, was that the priest was a neutral arbiter of moral good in medieval towns and villages. Because, and it was interesting, someone pointed out that priests take a vow, not of chastity, but of celibacy, of not getting married, which explains the curious historical fact that bishops would often have mistresses. Because it was a sin to not be chaste, but it didn't contradict their vows or their functional role. Because in that era, family and primogeniture and inheritance was essential for the nobility, right? That was how they functioned. And by taking themselves out of that status game, they were able to establish a type of moral authority by a vow of poverty and a vow of celibacy. And saying that I'm not going to play your status game is a really powerful way to say, I care about this other status game, which is aligned with the interests. And the modern examples of this are like Steve Jobs or Arnold Schwarzenegger, taking the dollar. Apparently there's a whole meme around $1 salaries as a signaling mechanism to say, hey, I'm serious about this. So anyway, that was the theory and the analysis.
Very interesting. So yes, I didn't have enough time to get to read it before. So I'm kind of arrived to school without doing my homework. So I'm kind of, all right, let's enjoy how the teacher is teaching the new subject. I was like, okay. So maybe the only thing at the end when you say about social proof, that's one of the dimensions of social influence, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of quite specific. So last time I explained 7 dimensions of social influence.
Mm-hmm.
And the closest one to this one is social norms. So how the something becomes normal. So when the majority is accepting that to be the right way to do it, then it becomes a norm. And it changes when that majority falls below the average and it goes into minorities. That means a shift of the norms. So if that's the phenomena you are implying by this social proof, it's that's the majority of the population is accepting it.
Well, so I think the interesting question is, which problem am I trying to solve, right? And so in this framing, and it's not the only one, right? It's just a good one to start with, is that the reason people don't adopt a pro-social behavior is because of imperfect information about the benefits of the behavior and the motivations of the people telling them to engage in the behavior. For me, when I was writing this thing, I thought a lot about global warming in this context, and about the people. So it is easy to find individuals who see the correlates of the fight against global warming as threatening to their status and their worldview, and acting to sabotage the game. And then people who, but it's also possible to look at this and see people who are advocates of global warming, who do believe in sort of global nationalism, right? Or, internationalism, and who denigrate nation states as also susceptible to the charge of having a self-interested metagame that they're playing. So the idea was that, at least by understanding that gives us insight into a wicked problem. Now, what's interesting, that's kind of the next layer of this is, so looking at this as an issue of imperfect information about benefits and motives and conflicting status games that people are playing illuminates many dynamics that certainly can sabotage transformational interventions. The interesting question for me from a theory perspective is, are there dynamics that you address in your tool that cannot be reduced to status games and resource games and imperfect information or asymmetric information problems?
So what I observe and experience over this discussion is your great ability to construct a play of elements and system, let's call it, that makes perfect sense, and it has its ingredients and components and interactions and explanations, definitions, and rules. I went through that journey in my own experience as a computer scientist, building information systems, first websites, almost no, it's not almost, it's really 26 years ago. Yes. And also later building all of these transforming urban systems where it was the essential necessity to define the game or define the intervention. What are the actors? What measures do we track? How we count the behaviors? How we build a feedback loop so those kind of activities of the agents are reflected to the other participants in the population so that they would be reacting to those. During the last, I would say, year or two, I kind of learned how the whole system can be designed for transformation. And then my latest work is rather from designing the outside experiences and figuring out how to put the things into the systematic interaction for achieving the result. I was reverting my interest inwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now, if you ask me this question, I would say, I'm not sure, because all of my interest has arrived to the point. And also I wanted to simplify things to the most possible simplest way to understand them. So as the Einstein said, to the simplest possible, but not simpler.
Yes.
And I've arrived that if there is any, let's say, barrier that is inhibiting change or transformation, it's first of all not outside of human beings, because we are constantly successfully developing technologies that of course reflect our biases as well to some degree, but still they will serve us. And then it means they are the servants and we are the masters. So, and if something is not changing, so there is something in the mind of the master that is not changing. And from that perspective, I have arrived that even when I speak with organizations or with communities, and they say, oh, people are not changing their behaviors in this specific context and that particular behavior, then there must be a reason that resides in their heads. And this ties into what you said about, what was the conditions, the information or the imperfect information?
Yeah, imperfect information.
Yes, that could be one of the things, that if there is the attitude towards a certain pro-social behavior, and that attitude is negative or neutral based on the imperfect information, that's the reason why. This is how it comes down to my work at the moment. And then if you really want to do the activate the transformation or enable or empower it, we then need to mindfully discover, and in this case, what is this imperfect information that is inhibiting that mind to think differently, and then need to replace it. For example, if present attitude in the human mind for the one person is, there is no climate change, like there is no damage to the climate change, and that sits there. So all of the consequent behaviors, whichever consequent they are, at the workplace, at home, in the shopping behavior, traveling behavior, they will be in congruence with that particular way of thinking. And if the attitude is there, as long as it's there, nothing's going to change. So the only thing to do it is the old attitude to be replaced with a new one. And that's the simplest way to understand the transformation, how it can be done. And then it's the question how to do this, shift the old attitude to the new one. And the new one is, there is climate change and we need to do, everyone needs to do, to do something. That would be the new one. And if a person has the new one, everyone has to do something about the climate change and every decision has to be made in the best possible way according to that, then the new decisions naturally produce better choices and behaviors that are supporting the climate and reverting the change to the positive direction. And my work and tools come into the game of shifting the two attitudes. So that's how I would reflect to your question.
Right. So what's interesting to me, though, is that when I look at what you're doing from my set of biases and filters, the information game is the easy one. The intention game is the hard one. And the if I was doing your tools, I would actually make number 8 number 1. Because first I want people to ask the hard question of, what exactly is your intent? And what exactly are you creating? And more importantly, having the empathy to understand how other people are perceiving your intent. Having been a management consultant in my early dark days of my career, I realized that we were brought in as the hired guns with the assumption that the executives wanted a good thing for the organization and therefore we must push that transformational intervention throughout the organization. With the benefit of hindsight, that is not always the case.
Right.
And in fact, the fact that that's not always the case, whether or not it was the case in that particular case, means that the institution has healthy antibodies to change. Is that they actually, and we had these really, and the being clueless about this fact made us completely unequipped to actually deal with the antibodies. We just saw them as stupid and evil and got annoyed at people who had them. As opposed to saying, hey, this is a healthy system that evolved to handle a noisy, dangerous environment. And if I'm trying to introduce a new signal into that environment without understanding the noise, A, I'm likely to fail, or worse, I am likely to succeed in a damaging way. And if you do not understand those things, then simple, naive interventions can create horrific consequences.
That makes perfect sense now. Yes. And thank you for suggesting about the revisiting the order of the tools. And it's not kind of fixed, of course, as a tool set in the framework have been evolving. It's a possibility, and thank you for giving this insight. And I might even try it out for the next master classes to run it this way and actually re-emphasizing the potential outcomes and the balance between the population and the designer or the manager in this case and the employees, and seeing those transformational efforts to potentially producing this balance between the benefits of the different parts of the population might be actually a good starting point to realize, okay, actually why we are doing it and what is the potential impact, and then actually diving into particular in solving a particular transformational intervention. That's a good idea.
All right, so let's break now because I'm almost out of my free Zoom time, and I think we're meeting on Monday, correct?
Yes.
So if you have the time, maybe read through the article, take some notes, and try to come up with the best question you can ask, or a list of questions that we can explore next time about limits of the model or application of the model or whatever. All right?
I would suggest that, of course, I would spend more time on reading this article, but then I think as you've created it, you would give possibly one particular case or just like one application and just run through it so that anyone who would be later watching it would be just getting it like, oh, this is how it works. Like one particular, like not explaining the concepts, but like running a one case through it just by referring, okay, this is, in this case, this is investigator, this is the agent, that's the population.
And would it be better to have a real world case or a toy case?
I would suggest a real world.
Okay. All right.
I think
I can take on global warming just to make it, since we started there. Nice, simple.
Oh, yeah? All okay. Right. Sounds
guaranteed
good
to make me friends. All right. Thanks, Agnis.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Talk to you Monday.
Yes. Cheers. Bye.